Hi, and welcome back to Rediscovering RC, my personal journey as I venture back into the world of RC and RC racing after an almost 20-year hiatus. I'm your host Julio, and as you can see here, I finally got around to building and completing my TLR 22 5.0 DC Elite. And in doing so, I took some notes, so I figured I would share that with you, share some of the pitfalls that I ran into while I was building this kit, and also show you some of the optional parts that I installed while I was building the kit. So with all that said, let's get on to it. Okay, so your build is going to begin with bag A, which is the differential assembly. The differential is probably one of the more critical components of the car, so you really want to get this right. Unfortunately, my build started on the left foot because although the differential assembly itself went smoothly, when it came time to put together the diff, I ran into a little bit of a problem. You see, I kept turning and turning on the diff screw, and for whatever reason, it just wouldn't catch on the diff nut. I mean, this led to me kind of partially disassembling the diff, squeezing that diff spring again, which is an important part of the assembly. You want to squeeze that spring first before putting it in. But in either case, after trying that several times, I just couldn't get it to catch. After about an hour and a half of losing time just trying to build the diff, I decided to go ahead and move on to bag B, and I figured I would come back to the diff later. Well, the next day, I took another stab at the differential, only to discover that the actual diff screw did not have any threads at all. So I'll probably put up a picture here in a corner somewhere to show you what the diff screw looked like. But essentially it went through the threading machine unscathed. That led me to contact Horizon Hobby Support. I have to say that they were fantastic. They took care of me right away. They sent some parts over, which I got in 2 days. Luckily, I was able to get the replacement diff screw sooner, so I was able to continue with my build. And other than that, the differential, once I finally got it together, was super smooth. I remember when I first built my first differential, which was the RC10 differential, and I thought that was smooth. This is light years beyond. It's amazing to me the technology, how much has progressed in, well, that would be almost 30 years from that point. So that's bag A, and that was really the only problem that I had. If you find yourself in a similar difficulty, go ahead and save yourself some time and take a look at that diff screw first to make sure that it has threads. Okay, so after bag A, you're going to move on to bag B, which is the turnbuckle assemblies. Now, the turnbuckle assemblies are pretty straightforward. The only thing that you really have to look out for is that each turnbuckle has a line on one side. That line represents the regular threaded direction. The opposite side of the turnbuckles are in a counter thread position, so that way when you put the ball cups and are actually assembling them, it'll pull in or pull out the ball cups as you're turning one way or the other. Now, the reason this is important is that TLR recommends when it comes time to install them on the car, which is later on in the build, that you put the lines on all the sides. So that way when you're adjusting on one corner, it's going to be the same way. So if you want to bring in the camber on one side, you want to pull out, and you'll be pulling out to bring in the camber on any side of the car, and so forth. The other thing you should watch out for is while you're building this, and the reason why this is very important is that there's two ball cups that are curved, and these are the ones that go into the Ackerman plates for the steering. Obviously, it's important. You don't want to get these backwards because you don't want to get in a situation where you end up cross-threading if you got to take one out and put it on the wrong side and turn the turnbuckle around. So go ahead and make sure that you have these on correctly. Make sure that you have all the lines on the same side so that when it comes time to put them on the car that they are built correctly. And that's pretty much it. It's a straightforward build. Now, this is where the first of my optional parts came in. Instead of using the regular HD ball cups, I went ahead and used the open ball cups, which I think were standard equipment on the 4.0. And you're going to find the open ball cups for every part except for the new Ackerman curved ball cups. So other than that, I decided to give it a chance. I've heard some cases where the ball cups tend to pop off from time to time, but I've also heard it with the regular HD ball cups that come with the 5.0 as well. So that's one thing to look for. Other than that, it was a straightforward build. I used the open ball cups as an optional part, and that's the end of bag B. Okay, so after bag B is bag C. And bag C, now you're going to be building the TLR shocks. Now, TLR took an interesting approach here in that they have you building some of the more time-consuming things. And shocks, although not really all that time-consuming, is you got to be really careful as you're putting them together because you want, they're going to be dealing with some O-rings, and you really want to get those in precisely because you want to avoid leaks later on. Again, the build was straightforward. It was very satisfying to build these shocks, especially feeling them. TLR has a great reputation for having the best shocks in the business, and I have to agree with that. These were a pleasure to put together, and I couldn't believe how smooth they feel. I can't believe it. I'm often coming to the car every once in a while just to feel how smooth the suspension is. So that pretty much wraps up bag C. and we'll move on to bag D. Okay, so now you're going to move on to bag D. And bag D is the steering assembly up here in the front. Now this is one of those components that are the optional aluminum parts that come in the DC Elite. But this is one of those parts that if somebody asked me, hey, the Elite is a lot of money, I want to save some money and buy one of the other kits, what optional parts would you recommend? The aluminum steering assembly is definitely one of the parts that I would recommend. Not only do you have the precision of the aluminum parts, but the motion steering back and forth is so smooth, I literally couldn't believe it. I mean, I have seen some pretty tight steering assemblies, but this one, there is absolutely no slop. So this is one of those parts where you're going to want to have that precision, because in racing, precision is absolutely needed. So really that's again, it's a part that comes with the DC Elite. If you don't build the DC Elite and you build one of the other variations of the 22 5.0, I highly recommend that you get that part. That being said, bag D was pretty straightforward, and let's move on to bag E. Okay, so when you get to bag E is now you're going to be building the outer hubs on the steering assembly. Now this again was pretty straightforward, just follow the instructions that you have in the manual. One thing and another optional part that I got is that the actual steering blocks have inserts that go on either side. One is composite, the other one is aluminum. Now based on feedback from TLR pros and Frank Root, product manager, they typically recommend that you get an extra pair of aluminum inserts to put on both sides. That will give you extra durability on the steering block, which is really what cradles the axle on the front. And again, it's one of those things, you're going to want durability. You want to make sure that if you get a hit or something like that your car is going to be able to keep going. And this is definitely one of those parts that I also highly recommend. The Elite, again, only comes with one composite and one aluminum. Get the two aluminum parts that put in that steering block, and your front end will be a little bit more solid. That being said, build bag E was pretty much straightforward, and let's move on to bag F. Okay, so now we're on to bag F, which bag F is pretty much a lot of this rear assembly here. Again, it's pretty straightforward, and I think I've probably said straightforward a lot here, but this has really been a great build. Anyways, when you put together the gearbox, a couple of things to keep in mind. When you're putting it together, there's a couple of inserts that go into the gearbox. Particularly the idler gear that sits in the center of the 3-gear assembly. You really want to make sure that those inserts are squared off when you put them in, and basically all the way in. If you don't put that in, you're going to have problems with your idler, and when you put the gearbox together, you probably will feel a little bit of resistance. Also, when you're mounting the gearbox to the chassis, you'll want to make sure that you use the proper screws. This is one of those areas where you're going to want to take a look at the manual, and I believe there are 10 millimeter screws and 12 millimeter screws. You definitely want to get those right, because if you put the longer screws in the wrong place, it could actually cause binding inside the gear. And I've heard cases of people that actually hear some weird sounds coming from the gearbox. So definitely make sure that you're using the correct length screws when you're installing the gearbox into the chassis. Other than that, again, bag F was pretty straightforward. Let's move on to bag G. Okay, so next was bag G. In bag G, you're pretty much finishing out the rear assembly here. That pretty much consists of the C and D blocks, the arms, the CVA assemblies, and the rear axles all together. So one of the things that are very important in terms of building together in particular are the C and D blocks. The C and D blocks obviously take some pills, which for fine tuning later on can be interchanged to change the characteristics of the rear arms. But the very important thing is that you want to make sure that those pills are fully inserted and square once they're seated. If they're not, when it comes time to put the arms into the rear, you're definitely going to run into some problems where you might get some bind in the arms. And of course, when you're putting together the suspension, you want the arms to literally fall, just from their own weight. You don't want any binding, because that's going to impact how the car handles. You're going to find that it's going to handle inconsistently. You're going to have all kinds of issues. I mean, it's tough enough trying to set up a car for a track. It's even harder when you have to deal with these kind of issues. So definitely make sure that your pills are properly inserted. Make sure that your arms have absolutely no bind, and I think you'll be in the clear. Now, as far as optional parts, I did opt to go with the brass C block. The brass C block adds a little bit more weight in the rear. The reason I went with that is that I'm going to be running on dirt, so I definitely want to try to get some additional weight in the rear to help plant the rear end. Also, I picked up, but I don't have installed yet, is the optional blocks that go underneath the gearbox, again, to add a little bit of more weight. The kit comes with 2 optional blocks, 25 grams and 50 grams, I believe are the 2 weights. And again, it's just to get that weight in the rear and add some, get the rear end planted. Now, on to the CVA assemblies. TLR really has an interesting assembly here in that It consists of a pin that goes through the axle, and the bearing, the inner bearing on the outside hub, kind of like squeezes over it and holds that pin in place. Pretty neat design, but one of the issues that I had, and an issue that I know other people have had when building this car, is that apparently the size between the pin that goes inside the CVA and the pin that eventually holds your hex, it's 0.2 of a millimeter different. And if you get them wrong, it could cause the bearing, when you go to slide over the CVA axle, to kind of either not fit, and in that case you're going to get some binding in the axle itself, or you're going to get binding in the actual joint. Now I kind of suffered from the latter. I have a little bit of a binding there in the joint. I know that my pins were correct. I don't know if this was an early kit that I purchased, so I don't know if maybe there was a mix-up in production early on. If you buy a kit today, you probably won't have that issue, but definitely keep the pins for the hexes and the pins for the CVA joints completely separate so you don't mix them up, because if you mix them up, you're going to have that problem. Now, as far as optional parts, if you'll allow me to take off one wheel here real quick, I did opt, and really this is totally optional, it's more a bling part than anything else, but again, it's an aluminum part, and I opted to go with it. Again, you know, playing the durability card, is the actual hub. You can get these hubs in aluminum as opposed to the composite. The part that holds the ball cup is aluminum in the kit, so you're going to get that either way, but I just like the look, especially with the TLR logo here on the top of the hub. Again, total bling part, but I loved it. I had to have it. So that pretty much completes bag G. Okay, so now we've made it to bag H, which is really where you're dotting the I's and crossing the T's on this kit. A lot of it is up front, because at this point, this is where you're going to be installing the servo. One of the option parts that I went with is the aluminum horn that you can get for this car, designed to go into the the TLR obviously, and again, another precision part. You know, the old days we used to run servo savers, and of course, you know, these cars are so precise these days that a servo saver would just make it feel sloppy when you're running around the track. So definitely it's an option part. You do get a composite part in the kit. I opted to go aluminum, and again, it's all part of that precise steering up front. As you noticed that when I previously revealed all my electronics, I am running a Spectrum S6240, the receiver version. So as you see, all I've got here on my electronics plate is my speed control. Very awesome. I mean, I played around with the radio a little bit, and the response on this steering is amazing. I think I'm going to be really happy when I get this out on the track. Now, talking about the servo, this is the step where you're going to be putting into the assembly, and this is one of those things where, you know, TLR gets criticized a lot about this. Comparing it to for example, the B6.1 and now B6.2 that came out, there's a little bit more room up front for you to maneuver and get the servo in and out. Associated kind of made this area a little bit more open. Now that being said, I mean, TLR has a pretty tight assembly here, as far as that it's very rigid. With the block up front and everything, I mean, you're not going to have any problems with the assembly on this car. But it is a little tight getting that servo and getting the ball cup. I mean, it's a very small link that comes in here that connects the steering assembly with the servo horn. And admittedly, I kind of had to, play around with it a little bit. It took me about 20 minutes to get this servo in there. Now, I do remember that TDK Repair, in his build notes, what he did was that he installed the servo earlier. So that's definitely an option that you might want to try when you start putting together, because this brace on top here in particular is the one that kind of hinders your progress a bit. So something to consider. You might want to go ahead and put that servo in earlier. Other than that, again, pretty straightforward. You go through and now start putting in all the electronics. As you can see, I have a Tiken RSX Pro here installed. I got all my wiring assemblies. I am running the ProTech RC battery. The one thing with this setup, even though I am saving a little space by only having a speed control on the plate and not a receiver, it still gets difficult to put the bands over the clips here on the battery once you got this in. So that's one of those things, if TLR made the bands a little bit longer, and this is the longer band of the two sets that you get, because this is a taller battery, it's one of those things where, you kind of like have to fiddle around to get it over the hook. I've a couple of times taken this battery in and out already. I could try to stretch it out and it doesn't quite make it, so I got to do it 2 or 3 times. That's really my only criticism overall about the putting this together and overall general working with the car. But in the end, that pretty much wraps up my notes. Overall, it was a fantastic build. It was a pleasure building this. It was my first kit in almost 20 years that I've built, and I'm looking forward to some of the other kits that I have. I mean, as precise as building this kit was, I'm looking forward to seeing some of the on-road cars to see how that goes. And I've also got the 22X4 that's going to be coming up in a couple of weeks, so I'm really going to be looking forward to build that as well. Well, that pretty much wraps up my build notes related to the TLR 22 5.0 DC Elite. Again, it was a great build. The only things that I would suggest in a post-build are very important. Your diff braking. Your diff braking is a very important process. Again, in touch with TLR, they have an episode solely dedicated to not only the diff break-in, but also getting your slipper clutch set. So I highly advise that you go over to the TLR YouTube channel and watch those In Touch with TLR episodes. They're very informative, and I use those as a guide to get through this build. So my diff is already broken in. I've already got my clutch set. I'm pretty much ready to go after I button up some of these things. I've got really just the wiring on the switch that I got to get there put in place. I want to get a little antenna tube for the antenna that's built into the receiver. I have to take care of that. And other than that, paint a body, and I should be ready to head out to the track in a week or so. Really looking forward to it. And when I do, hopefully I'll be able to share some video with you guys and update you on my progress. Well, that'll do for today's episode. I think I'll leave you with a little bit of B-roll from that from that break-in process that I took. And until next time, I'm Julio, and we'll see you next time.